Transportation will come to order. This morning we're having an executive session on a new number of bills, and I thank my colleagues for being here. We will also vote to approve Admiral Fagan to lead the U.S. Coast Guard on several Coast Guard promotions. Today, the committee will vote on the Consumer Protection Remedies Act. In the last couple of years, we have seen the explosion of fraud and scams trying to take advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to rip off consumers, whether it's selling fake cures, counterfeit N95 masks, or promising big payoffs to work from home. A report issued last week by this committee that we authored found that in 2021 alone, consumers reported to the FTC losing more than $5.8 billion to fraud and deceptive practices. And it's not getting any better. That's why we introduced legislation to restore the FTC's authority to go to court and obtain redress for consumers who've been scammed out of their hard-earned money, or for small business owners who've been locked out of competitive marketplaces. We know this authority works. In 5 years before the Supreme Court gutted the FTC's long-standing authority, it returned over $11.2 billion illegally taken from consumers. Ensuring the FTC can protect consumers from bad actors has always been a bipartisan pursuit. In fact, Senators Wicker and Blackburn introduced originally this legislation as part of the 2020 Safe Data Act. The one thing, and the broad range of stakeholders can agree on, is that the authority should be restored to the FTC. We heard this testimony from FTC commissioners, both Republicans and Democrats in this committee. Some stakeholders want Congress to place greater restrictions on the court's ability to require bad actors to refund money to consumers or stop them from acting, but we are just looking to restore the authority that existed and worked well for more than 40 years. It's far too important not to get right, and so we need to protect consumers from these scams and deceptive practices. I know my colleagues also want to get this right, and we will continue to work together to do so. Along the same lines of protecting consumers, Senator Klobuchar, Blumenthal, Markey, Baldwin, and Lujan have co-sponsored the Sturdy Act to help protect children from injury due to faulty bedroom clothing dressers that can tip over and tip on top of them. This legislation directs the Consumer Product Safety Commission to work towards a mandatory product safety standard for clothing storage units within the next year. We will consider another important child protection bill, Reese's Law, co-sponsored by Senators Blumenthal, Blackburn, Markey, and Lujan, and thank all of you for working on this. Reese's Law directs the CPSC to issue a safety standard for button cell and coin batteries that products contain, including the clearly visible warning labels about the dangers possessed if children are to swallow them. These standards would also require batteries to be secured within a compartment to prevent young children from getting to them. This is such an important issue, and it must be fixed. Shifting to an environmentally focused bills, the Alaska Salmon Research Task Force Act, sponsored by Senators Sullivan and Murkowski, would establish a task force to review existing research, identify research needs, and support conservation and recovery of salmon that originate from watersheds in the state of Alaska. We have the Volcanic Ash and Fumes Act of 2022, sponsored by Senator Schatz, which will make important improvements to the National Volcano Early Warning System. Senator Murkowski and I introduced legislation in 2018 establishing the warning system, which is critical to states like Hawaii and Washington and Alaska. 5 volcanoes listed by the USGS as high or very high threat potentials are in the state of Washington. Next, we have the Providing Research Estimates of Changes in Precipitation Act, sponsored by Senators Booker and Wicker. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration provides maximum precipitation estimates that are used by local governments, floodplain managers, and most importantly, emergency responders who rely on this data to manage public safety during severe storms. Much of the data NOAA relies on hasn't been updated in decades, and we must give first responders the best available science to protect our communities, and this bill does just that. Next, we will consider the National Manufacturing Extension Program Supply Chain Database Act from Senators Blackburn and Menendez. During this pandemic, many small manufacturers struggled to find suppliers, many times the building desperately needed this equipment. Manufacturers pushed to build on the existing resources of state MEP centers, which work directly with small businesses to connect them with these suppliers. This bill would enable the MEP centers to connect to the database of domestic manufacturers on a national level, and this is helped through the Department of Commerce. Next up is another important supply chain bill, the Network Equipment Transparency Act, co-sponsored by Senators Hickenlooper, Moran, Tester, and Capito. The NET Act would increase transparency in the telecom communication supply chain sector so that the FCC can understand how disruptions in the supply chain impact broadband infrastructure. And we will also consider the Bipartisan Fair Contributions Act by Senators Wicker, Capito, Young, and Lujan. This legislation would task the FCC with studying the feasibility of assessing contributions on broadband edge providers such as search engines and social media companies and the streaming services to support the needs of universal service programs. So I very much appreciate all my colleagues' hard work on these legislation and the fact that we can move them forward. We also will be approving the nomination of Admiral Linda Fagan to serve as the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. Admiral Fagan is a true leader, and I look forward to working with her on many of the challenges facing the Coast Guard. As we have noted at her consideration hearing, she will be the first woman to lead any branch of our U.S. Armed Forces. I also want to recognize that 5 other Coast Guard promotions are on the markup today, and these individuals will be filling important posts across the Coast Guard, and I want to thank them for their willingness to serve. And now I'll turn to Senator Wicker.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your opening remarks. There are 11 items on the agenda today. I think we're going to make great bipartisan progress on 10 of these. Regrettably, there's one item, number 9, S4145, that I really don't think we have a meeting of the minds on yet or a consensus within the committee, but I think we can still work on that. Let me highlight just a few of the agenda items. We'll consider the fair contributions legislation, which I authored. This bill would help address the stability and sustainability of the Universal Service Fund by requiring the FCC to study the feasibility of adding broadband providers, big tech, and other large users to the internet, to the base of those who contribute to the fund. These companies have benefited from connectivity that the USF supports, but they've not yet had to contribute. Expanding the base to include these companies would ensure that the USF can support broadband in rural areas for years to come, and could also help lower bills for consumers across the country. I'm also pleased the committee will be voting on 6 important promotions to the Coast Guard, as the chair outlined, including Admiral Linda Fagan's historic nomination to be Commandant, and current Vice Admiral Stephen Poulin and his nomination to replace her as Vice Commandant. These individuals are all highly qualified and dedicated to the service of our nation, and I look forward to the swift confirmation of each of them by the full Senate. Before we move to voting today, I do want to discuss an important issue before us today. For several decades, the FCC had relied on Section 13B of the FTC Act to obtain court orders for monetary redress in consumer protection cases without prior use of administrative proceedings as required under the Act. On April 22nd of 2021, in AMG Capital Management versus Federal Trade Commission, the United States Supreme Court held unanimously that Section 13B does not authorize the FTC to seek such equitable monetary relief in consumer protection or antitrust cases. Last Congress, I included a provision in my data privacy bill to clarify the FTC's authority under Section 13B of the FTC Act. This was done in good faith to reach a bipartisan compromise on federal data privacy legislation. More than 2 years later, members of this committee are still negotiating on how to protect the data of millions of Americans, and I appreciate that. Regrettably, the committee has made little progress on data privacy, and states are still having to act to fill the void. Nevertheless, in the past 11 months, we have learned much about how the current leadership at the FTC approaches the law, as well as agency precedent and tradition. And what we've learned is not reassuring. In less than a year, we have seen the elimination of longstanding bipartisan policy statements, the use of so-called zombie votes, and the exclusion of minority commissioners from investigations. We've seen the majority commissioners revise rules without public input and reduce transparency in the agency's processes. All steps in the wrong direction, in my judgment. In addition, this committee has not held an FTC oversight hearing since Lena Khan became chair. This is troubling and underscores the need to implement clear guardrails in 13B legislation to ensure the FTC acts in a manner consistent with congressional intent and does not overstep or abuse its authority. The bill on the agenda today, S 4145, fails to incorporate meaningful guardrails that would protect legitimate businesses from undue harassment from the FTC. Of course, it remains important that the FTC be able to restore ill-gotten gains to consumers, but Congress should take a measured and bipartisan approach to the authorities needed to protect consumers, rather than rushing to restore fully a commission practice that was unanimously struck down by the United States Supreme Court. I hope moving forward we can work together and give this critical issue the process and attention it deserves. And I just might add, Madam Chair and my fellow members of the committee on both sides of the dais, I think it is highly possible and achievable that we can reach consensus on some very important issues during the remainder of this Congress, including the 13B issue, which I do believe needs more time. The chair and I will be working closely, shoulder to shoulder, on the conference committee on USICA. I believe a legislative vehicle is within reach there if we work together in good faith. And I continue to believe we can resolve the data privacy issue before the election also. So I'm hopeful for great progress. This is going to require the chair and me to spend a lot of time together and work together in good faith. I'm sure we will be doing that, and we certainly invite the suggestions and input of the very knowledgeable members of this committee on these and other important issues. But for today, I'm pleased that we will resolve at least 10 very crucial matters for our republic. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you, Senator Wicker, and thank you for that statement. Ever since the Seahawks got rid of their quarterback and first-round draft pick was a Mississippi person to join our line, I think it's very important that we work shoulder to shoulder to get the rest of our legislative agenda done.
Shoulder pad to shoulder pad.
Exactly. So I will recognize you now if you would like to make a motion.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I move that S 2427, the Fair Contributions Act, as modified by the Wicker substitute and Lee 1. S 3053, the Providing Research and Estimates of Changes in Precipitation Act, as modified by the Baldwin substitute, as modified, and Lee 2, Lee 5, and Lee 6. S 3232, the Sturdy Act, as modified by the Klobuchar, Blumenthal, Casey, Blunt substitute. S 3278, Reese's Law, as modified by the Blumenthal, Blackburn substitute, as modified, and Lee 1 and Lee 2. S 3290, the National MEP Supply Chain Database Act of 2021, as modified by the Blackburn substitute, as modified, and Lee 1 and Lee 2. S 3429, the Alaska Salmon Research Task Force Act, as modified by the Sullivan substitute, as modified. S 3533, the Volcanic Ash and Fumes Act of 2022, as modified by Wicker, Lee, Scott 1, as modified. And S 3692, Network Equipment Transparency Act, as modified by Lee 3, as modified, be reported favorably.
Is there a second? Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The motion is agreed to.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Senator Lee.
I'd like to be recorded as a no on 24, 27, and 3290.
Be so noted.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I'd like to be
Senator Scott.
reported as a no on 24, 27, and 3290.
So noted. I now recognize Senator Wicker for another motion.
Madam Chair, I move that PN 1947 nomination of Admiral Linda L. Fagan to be the Coast Guard Commandant, and PN 1916, PN 1945, PN 1946, PN 2000, and PN 2001 be favorably reported.
Is there a second? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The motion is agreed to. Now recognize Senator Klobuchar for a motion.
Thank you very much, Chair Cantwell. I move that Senate 4145, the Consumer Protection Remedies Act of 2022, be favorably reported.
Is there a second? Is there discussion? Senator Lee, would you like to offer an amendment?
Yes, if that's all right. I would like to call up the lease substitute to S4145. Congress first created the Federal Trade Commission back in 1914, over a century ago, and it did so giving the FTC a broad mission, one to protect consumers and one to promote competition. In 1973, Congress added Section 13B to the Federal Trade Commission Act, giving the FTC the authority to seek injunctions, both permanent and preliminary injunctions, enforced by the FTC. In the late 1970s, during a period of time when FTC was engaging in a rulemaking binge, in which the Washington Post dubbed the agency the national nanny, the FTC began to use its 13B authority to seek equitable monetary relief, including restitution and disgorgement. Remember, injunctive relief is when a court orders someone to do something, typically. The court was unanimous, let me repeat, unanimous, in its agreement that the FTC, for nearly 4 decades, had been unlawfully using its 13B authority and illegally obtaining what totaled many billions of dollars from companies in a manner that Congress never authorized in the first place. And now before the committee is an active debate on whether and in what way we ought to authorize the use of 13B authority, which brings us to today. There's a good argument to be made here that the FTC, under the leadership of the current FTC chair, Lena Khan, should not be granted additional authorities, even 13B authority, because we can't trust the direction of the commission. We can't trust the commission specifically under her leadership to humbly use the powers that Congress has given to the commission. In fact, I filed 3 first-degree amendments today, which touch on just a few of the questionable actions taken by the commission. First, the FTC rescinded its 2015 antitrust and competition guidance document. This leaves in question whether the commission will adhere to the consumer welfare standard and refrain from engaging in enforcement actions that would run afoul of the existing antitrust laws. Second, the FTC has expressed the use of its authority to engage in rulemaking regarding unfair methods of competition. This would allow the FTC to regulate broad swaths of the economy, which Congress did not vest the FTC with the power to do. And finally, the FTC rescinded a number of its MAG-MOS procedural requirements under Section 18 to allow them to engage in an easier process for rulemaking, a clear violation of what Congress directed and intended through its clear statutory mandate. And these are but a few of the power grabs that the FTC, under FTC Chair Khan, has recently been taking. I know a number of my colleagues today have also filed amendments that expose the recent dangerous actions and practices of the FTC. FTC Commissioner Wilson summed up my concerns well during a recent open meeting of the Federal Trade Commission. She noted specifically in the context of Section 13B that, quote, the Commission must avoid using its authority in ways that exceed the boundaries of underlying statutes and corresponding congressional intent. Later, she stated, quote, if we engage in rulemaking and enforcement actions that exceed our jurisdiction, we will not engender confidence among members of Congress who have expressed qualms about FTC's history of frolics and detours. But we need Congress to clarify our 13B authority. So we must demonstrate that we will be careful stewards of that authority. Now, Commissioner Wilson is exactly right. Congress needs to balance these concerns regarding providing 13B authority, balance them with appropriate safeguards to counteract the actions of the Commission. Remember, until just over a year ago, they had for decades been violating the law, and it took a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court to conclude otherwise. Some might ask, why was the decision 9-0? It was 9-0 because there are only 9 members of the court. That's why it was 9-0. Now, unfortunately, the bill presented by Chair Cantwell does not, in my view, balance these considerations and would provide a virtually unlimited authority to the Commission to not only seek monetary remedies for unfair practices or deceptive practices, but also for antitrust provisions that would put the FTC with potentially more powerful tools than are available even to the Department of Justice. And so my substitute amendment today is the text of legislation I've introduced, S-3140, the Consumer Protection and Due Process Act, which I introduced in December of last year. It does not give the FTC the authority under Section 13B to pursue equitable monetary remedies, but, I'm sorry, it does give that authority, but it does so in a manner that's balanced and that has appropriate safeguards accompanied with it. So this is giving the FTC what it has wanted and illegitimately claimed for decades. It's just doing so with appropriate safeguards, taking into account the fact that they've used this power recklessly in the past. Here are some of the main differences between the substitute that I've offered and the underlying bill. First, my substitute extends the FTC's authority under 13B for monetary remedies to unfair or deceptive trade practices. And in order to avoid a conflict with the antitrust laws, the FTC is required under my amendment to turn over the pursuit of equitable monetary remedies for violations of unfair methods of competition to the Department of Justice to pursue. Second, my substitute requires 2 key due process protections in potential litigation. First, it adopts a reasonable person standard, under which the FTC would have to prove that a person who committed an unfair or deceptive trade practice must have known or should have known that the act was unlawful. This provides an important safeguard for due process. It's not unfamiliar to this area of the law. In fact, it's very similar to what Congress is required of the Commission in Section 19. Second, it requires the FTC to present the evidence for consumer harm. This ensures that remedies be awarded if the FTC proves that a consumer was harmed because they relied on the violator's unlawful practice and that such practice actually, in fact, caused the harm to the individual. Finally, my substitute sets the statute of limitations at 3 years instead of 10. And this ensures that the statute of limitations is more consistent with what it would be for in the analogous context of existing tort law. I believe my amendment strikes the appropriate balance, giving the FTC 13B authority and doing so in a safe manner with appropriate safeguards. And I'm grateful for the co-sponsorship of Senators Lummis, Cruz, Blackburn, and Blunt. And I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I'll be asking for a roll call vote.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Speaking against the amendment, first I want to note that last week we issued a report on the FTC's work in this area, and I'm not sure everybody had copies, but I hope that the clerk will pass out copies of that important report because it is specific to everybody's individual states and some of the major cases. This amendment takes the equitable out of equitable relief and tips the scale in favor of those who break the law to allow them to keep the money they unlawfully take from consumers. Far from providing consumer relief, this amendment is designed to make difficult, if not impossible, for the FTC to obtain refunds for consumers who are victims of fraud and deception. This amendment would require the FTC to present individualized proof that each consumer materially relied on the Unfair and Deceptive Act, and that the deceptive act or practice proximately caused harm to the consumer. In a case involving tens of thousands of victims, the FTC would have an impossible task to prove that it was in the mind of every consumer before a refund of any amount was awarded. These consumers would be required to testify on their state of mind when they made an online purchase or read an ad. This is a burdensome and inefficient and unfair way for consumers who have been harmed. This would simultaneously slow down the process by which consumers are compensated, and the 3-year statute of limitations would drastically shorten the time the FTC has to act. This amendment would require the FTC to prove that a reasonable individual would have known that the conduct was unfair or deceptive. This standard creates a loophole where defendants, after the court has determined they've engaged in unfair deceptive practice, could just claim they didn't know the conduct was unfair and deceptive. This standard effectively makes the FTC prove 2 cases, one about the defendant's actions and a case about the respondent's responsible person knew about the actions. High barriers like this mean consumers will rarely see refunds when they are scammed by big tech or opportunistic peddlers of fake cures. This amendment would safeguard really companies who've gotten ill-gotten gains from unfair methods of competition. The FTC would not have the ability to seek disgorgement from pharma giants like AbbVie, who use the anti-competitive conduct to keep low drug prices off the market while consumers continue to pay for ever-increasing drug costs. This amendment would authorize the U.S. Attorney to seek damages on behalf of injured consumers by filing a separate action under the Clayton Act. But that means in order to disgorge ill-gotten gains for the benefit of consumers, it would have to take to trials. So this is inefficient, and I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Cantwell. I just want to put some money numbers on this so our colleagues understand what we're talking about. For more than 40 years, the FTC has returned billions of dollars to consumers. And in fact, in the 5 years before 2021, and this, of course, includes the FTC with Chairman Simon under the Trump administration, the FTC actually provided $11.2 billion in restitution to consumers and businesses. My point is, through various administrations, the FTC has continued to give money back to consumers when they get ripped off. So what happened? Why are we having this discussion? Well, in April 2021, the Supreme Court, in a case, took the authority away from the FTC, which was quite a shocker for people who are victims of these cases, severely limiting the Commission's ability to provide restitution to victimized consumers. So that's what they felt when they looked at the law. It's our job to fix the law so that the FTC, no matter what you think of the chair, no matter who you now and in perpetuity, can continue to help people and give the money back. And we are at a time right now where it couldn't be more important. Last year, the FTC reported that consumers lost more than $5.8 billion in fraud, an increase of more than 70% over the previous year. We've had hearings about this. We know what's been going on during the pandemic. So it's an important time to fix this. As the chair noted, Senator Lee's substitute amendment would mean turning our backs on supporting the FTC, no matter who's president, their ability to hold bad actors accountable. It would prevent the FTC, an agency that was created to enforce our antitrust laws, from returning money to victims of unfair anti-competitive conduct. If this amendment was passed, the FTC could bring an antitrust case in court and win and still be unable to seek restitution for consumers. On top of all that, the amendment would also raise the burden of proof the FTC will have to satisfy, as the chair noted, to allow the court to grant restitution at a 3-year statute of limitations, ensure that scammers don't have to pay a penny more than their net profits directly related to violation. These are roadblocks. Senator Lee and I work together very well on many things in our antitrust subcommittee, but we have a profound disagreement on this. Because I think we've had a court case. There's 3 branches of government. Oftentimes the court makes decisions. They look to us to make changes if they don't agree with the law as it is. This is our moment to make sure that the FTC can continue, no matter who is president, to do their work to protect consumers.
Further discussion? Senator Lee.
I want to point out that what's been described here is a false choice. It is a false choice to say that we've got to either take your bill as is or leave consumers unprotected. It's not accurate. I mean, my bill does, in fact, give them 13B authority they've been exercising 13B authority to seek monetary relief, authority that they've been exercising for decades, collecting literally billions of dollars, even without the authority to do that. But it does give them that authority. It just says, let's give them that authority, but with appropriate safeguards to make sure that we've got oversight over what they're doing. It's very important, given that we've got an FTC that's running roughshod over all sorts of statutory limitations on their power, and has for decades, but even more so now. And also due process protections. We do owe it to all Americans to make sure that we protect the due process rights of Americans, of American businesses, of those who work for them. So it is a false choice to suggest that we've got to either take your bill or none at all. And my bill is a reasonable compromise between FTC needing this authority and FTC having so much authority that it doesn't have reasonable, meaningful due process constraints on its power.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Blumenthal?
No.
Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Mr. Markey? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Warnock? No. Mr. Wicker?
Aye.
Mr. Thune?
Aye.
Mr. Blunt?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Sullivan?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn? Aye. Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Johnson?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Capito?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott?
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Lummis? Aye. Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 14, the yeses are 14.
Senator Moran, would you like to offer an amendment?
Yes, Chairman, I would. I'd like to call up Moran Amendment Number 1. It is an amendment to S 4145. My amendment is, along with Senator Cruz, is a common sense, good governance measure that would make certain only current FTC commissioners are making decisions on the business before the commission. In November, there was a Politico report regarding the FTC's use of so-called ghost votes that former Commissioner Chopra cast on his last day at the commission. According to the FTC, their rules would allow those votes to be used for business before the commission for up to 60 days. My amendment would alter the FTC Act to prohibit votes made on open or pending FTC matters by commissioners who have left the commission from having an effect after they leave. In other words, this amendment would ensure that once a commissioner leaves the FTC, their votes would no longer have an effect on pending commission business. This change would be retroactive to the beginning of 2021. This amendment is based upon my FTC Integrity Act, which is co-sponsored by 6 members of this committee. Again, I believe this is a straightforward, sensible reform that supports good governance, and I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Any further discussion? I appreciate Senator Moran's intentions. I think that this is something we still need to work on, but I'm happy to continue working with you on it. So if no further discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The amendment is adopted. Are there any further amendments to the bill? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Peters? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Ms. Duckworth? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Ms. Rosen? Aye. Mr. Lujan? Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper? Aye. Mr. Warnock? Aye. Mr. Wicker?
No.
Mr. Thune?
No.
Mr. Blunt?
No by proxy.
Mr. Cruz,
No by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Sullivan?
No by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn? No. Mr. Young?
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Johnson?
No by proxy.
Mrs. Capito?
No by proxy.
Mr. Scott?
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis?
No by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell? Aye. The ayes are 14, the noes are 14.
The vote will be reported to the floor. That concludes the votes today. I certainly appreciate all my colleagues' attendance. I know how hard it is to get these bills worked on and get before all of us and gather us at this process. I'll recognize any member who wants to speak on their legislation brought up today. Senator Hickenlooper. Oh. Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell. I want to speak for a moment about the bill that we just voted on. Victims of fraud should be made whole, and I think that all senators on this committee would agree to that. It's only fair that Arizonans who've been scammed out of their money should be able to get it back. So I supported the bill today because I believe that the FTC needs to have its 13B authority reauthorized, and the bill is a good start, but I don't think the bill is perfect, and I have some reservations about the bill in its current state. We need to do more work on this bill before it reaches the floor. I believe we should make some compromises and further amend the bill so that it garners bipartisan support and ensures that there are appropriate protections against overreach. To be able to deliver results to American consumers who've been victimized by fraudsters and scammers, we're going to have to work together and work across the aisle. And I'm ready to continue work with my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, to get this bill across the finish line and ensure that Americans get their money back. Thank you, Chair Cantwell.
Thank you. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank Senators Capito, Tester, and Moran for working with us on the Network Equipment Transparency Act. Also thank Senator Lee, as he leaves, for working with us on his amendment to our bill. Especially thank Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker for the bill's markup consideration. Closing the digital divide and expanding affordable high-speed broadband service to all Americans is a bipartisan priority of this committee. We need a resilient supply chain to complete federally funded broadband projects on time. In Colorado, companies are reporting major delays on orders for fiber optic cables, batteries, antennas, other network equipment needed to get the job done. Our bill requires the Federal Communications Commission to monitor and alert Congress if a supply chain disruption delays broadband projects. Our focus is on delay chains and really lowering costs for all Americans. I'd like to thank the committee for allowing the NET Act to move forward.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank you for two of the bills that I have that are on today's markup. First, Reese's Law. This is named for Reese Hamsmith. She was an 18-month-old child who died last year after ingesting a button cell battery from a remote control. This legislation is going to help to protect children and families from products that are poorly designed and life-threatening by directing the CPSC to create safety standards to prevent accidental ingestion of these button batteries. And the committee also considered the National MEP Supply Chain Database Act. I've done this with Senator Menendez. This bill would authorize NIST to create a national database with information about the capabilities of manufacturers in the country's supply chain. We have all seen how the supply chain crisis is hurting businesses and consumers across the country, and this legislation will bring needed transparency to manufacturers, businesses, and states that are struggling to get their supply chains back on track. And I thank you for the consideration.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Thank you for your leadership on this issue. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you, Chair, and Ranking Member Wicker for this important markup and for including the Sturdy Act, something that Senator Casey and Blumenthal and I have literally been working on for years, as well as, of course, what we just discussed, the Consumer Protection Remedies Act. What's the Sturdy Act? Well, each year, nearly 10,000 children are sent to emergency rooms as a result of furniture tip-over injuries. Whether it's a shelf, a wardrobe, or a dresser, tip-over can happen in less than a second. I will always remember Janet McGee's story. I was just with her last month. Her 22-month-old son, an adorable little boy named Teddy, was killed when an IKEA mall dresser tipped over on him while he was in his room for an afternoon nap. Tragically, the dresser was not secured to the wall, and like so many Americans, his family members were unaware of the danger the dresser posed, including 2 previous deaths from the same model. This resulted in the largest furniture recall in the history of America. But that's not enough, because we want to make sure that it doesn't happen again. We called on then Consumer Product Safety Commissioner Chairman Elliott Kay and IKEA, North America's CEO Mike Ward, to take action. They did recall the dresser, as I note, 29 million Malm dressers, but there's still so much more that needs to be done to keep our kids safe. And that's why Senator Casey Blumenthal and I introduced the Sturdy Act, which would create the first mandatory standard for manufacturers to test for tip-overs. There are ways to make this less dangerous. This means safer chests, bureaus, dressers, and more. I'm glad we were able to reach across the aisle and come to an agreement on the text before us today. Implementing these safety standards will go a long way towards making homes safer. Together, we can protect the kids of this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Thank you for your leadership on so many of these issues. We certainly appreciate your voice on consumer product safety and on helping to make sure there's competition in the marketplace. Any other comments? If not, we're adjourned.